Some mysteries refuse to fade into history, lingering like echoes in places we still cannot explain. From vanished civilizations to objects that defy logic, the past is filled with questions without answers. What really happened behind these strange events, and why do they still puzzle experts today? So sit back, relax, and let's dive in together into the unknown world. At the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates once carved life through dry plains, lie the ruins of Babylon, a city that once rose with walls said to gleam like baked gold under the sun. Today, it is mostly silence and broken stone. Yet within its legend, one structure continues to defy certainty more than any other: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Described in ancient accounts as a towering green sanctuary rising against the harsh Babylonian climate, the gardens are often imagined as a series of elevated terraces overflowing with cascading vines, dense trees, and exotic plants. In a land defined by heat and dust, it was said to resemble a mountain of life, carefully constructed where nature itself should not have been able to thrive. But unlike the great ziggurats and palaces that have left physical traces in the soil, the gardens remain elusive, present in story, absent in stone. The most widely known narrative places their creation during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. According to later Greek historians, he built them for a royal consort who longed for the green hills of her distant homeland. In this version, the gardens were not merely decorative. They were emotional architecture, an attempt to recreate memory itself in living form. Terraced platforms of brick and stone would have been layered with rich soil, supported by complex engineering to hold moisture in an otherwise unforgiving climate. Water, drawn from the Euphrates, is often described as being lifted through early mechanical systems, possibly screw pumps or chain lifts, circulating continuously to sustain the dense vegetation above the city. And yet, as compelling as this vision is, archaeology introduces an unsettling silence. Despite extensive excavations in Babylon, no definitive remains of such a massive elevated garden have been identified. No clearly recognized irrigation infrastructure matches the scale described in ancient texts. No inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar II's own records explicitly mention such a project. For a civilization that documented its achievements in remarkable detail, this absence raises a quiet but persistent question. If the Hanging Gardens were real, why have they left so little trace? This uncertainty opens a space where history begins to blur with interpretation. One possibility is that the gardens did exist in Babylon, but their structure was unlike the romantic descriptions passed down through Greek writers such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus. Some scholars suggest a more grounded design, perhaps not a towering vertical forest, but a series of royal garden terraces integrated into palace complexes. In this view, later historians may have amplified the scale and wonder of what was originally an impressive but more modest royal garden, reshaping it into something mythic through repetition and distance. But another theory shifts the entire location of the story. In the ruins of ancient Assyria, near the city of Nineveh, archaeologists uncovered extensive evidence of advanced irrigation systems attributed to Sennacherib. These systems included aqueducts, canals, and inscriptions describing a wonder for all peoples, a lush royal garden supported by engineered water transport across long distances. Some researchers propose that what later became known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have actually originated here, in Nineveh, and was gradually misattributed over centuries of storytelling and translation. If this is true, then the Babylon of the Hanging Gardens may not refer to a physical location at all, but rather to a cultural symbol, a name that Greek historians used as a stand-in for Mesopotamian grandeur in general. Over time, the identity of the gardens may have shifted, detached from their original setting, and reattached to the more famous city of Babylon, where imagination found a more fitting stage. There are also more speculative interpretations, though they remain outside mainstream consensus. Some propose that the gardens were never a single monumental structure, but a composite memory, a blending of multiple royal gardens across different cities, each contributing fragments to a unified legend. Others suggest that early travelers, encountering extraordinary but separate irrigation gardens in Mesopotamia, may have merged their impressions into one exaggerated account. In this way, the Hanging Gardens could represent not a place, but a narrative convergence, where observation, memory, and storytelling became inseparable. Even the engineering itself invites questions that remain only partially answered. Could ancient Mesopotamian technology truly have supported continuous vertical irrigation on such a scale? Experimental reconstructions of early water-lifting devices show that it is possible, though labor-intensive and fragile. Yet feasibility does not confirm existence. It only suggests that under certain conditions, such a structure could have been built. And so the mystery persists, suspended between possibility and absence. What makes the Hanging Gardens so compelling is not only the question of whether they existed, but why they endure so strongly in historical memory, despite the lack of physical evidence. Cities rise and fall, monuments erode into dust, but this one image, a green mountain in the heart of a desert empire, continues to return across centuries of writing, as if preserved somewhere beyond archaeology in the collective imagination itself. Was it a real place lost to time and destruction? A misremembered marvel of another city later renamed in story? Or something else entirely? A symbol shaped so vividly that it became indistinguishable from reality? Standing among the fragmented ruins of Babylon today, where wind moves through broken walls and sun bleaches ancient brick, it is difficult not to wonder what once filled these empty spaces. And perhaps more importantly, what stories still lie buried beneath them, waiting for evidence that may never come. From the silent ruins of Mesopotamia, where the Hanging Gardens exist only as a question suspended in time, the trail of mystery does not end. It shifts. It moves westward, across mountains and seas, into the northern reaches of the Mediterranean world. Here, on the rugged hills and coastal plains of ancient Italy, another civilization emerges from the shadows of history with an origin story just as uncertain, just as debated. Along the western edge of the Italian peninsula lies Etruria, a landscape of rolling hills, volcanic soil, and quiet valleys that once held one of the most sophisticated cultures of pre-Roman Europe. Today, it is divided between modern Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria, but beneath its soil rests a civilization that predates much of what later became classical Rome. This was the world of the Etruscans, an enigmatic people whose presence is undeniable, yet whose beginnings remain frustratingly unclear. Step into the necropolises of Tarquinia or Cerveteri, and the silence feels almost preserved. Tombs carved into stone replicate the architecture of homes that no longer stand above ground. Painted scenes still survive in fading pigments, banquets, dances, ritual processions, offering glimpses into a society that celebrated life with remarkable intensity. Yet even here, where the Etruscans speak most clearly through art, they remain silent about where they came from. Unlike many ancient cultures, the Etruscans left no origin narrative of their own that has survived intact. What remains comes from outsiders, most notably the Greek historian Herodotus, who recorded one of the earliest and most influential theories. According to his account, the Etruscans may have originated in the region of Lydia in Anatolia, driven by famine or hardship to migrate westward across the sea. In this telling, they arrived in Italy as settlers, carrying with them language, customs, and a new cultural identity that would eventually take root and flourish. But this is only one interpretation, preserved through the lens of distant observation. Centuries later, another ancient writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, challenged this idea. He argued instead that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, that they did not arrive from elsewhere, but emerged organically from the land itself, developing their culture locally over time. In this view, the Etruscans were not migrants, but originals, not arrivals, but descendants of a deeper Italian past that predates recorded memory. Between these two accounts, migration and origin, history leaves a wide, unresolved space. Modern archaeology adds structure to the debate, but does not fully close it. The Etruscans are known to have flourished between roughly 900 BC and 100 BC, establishing city-states, trade networks, and religious systems that later influenced the rise of Rome. Their language, written in an alphabet derived from early Greek scripts, survives only in fragments, inscriptions on tombs, pottery, and religious objects. Yet even with these fragments, the language stands apart, unrelated to neighboring Indo-European languages, forming a linguistic isolate that still resists full interpretation. How does a civilization so integrated into early European development leave behind a language so isolated, so resistant to classification? Was it preserved from an older linguistic layer now lost? Or was it carried from a distant homeland that has yet to be definitively identified? The material culture of the Etruscans adds another layer to the mystery. Their art reveals both local innovation and external influence. They adopted elements from Greek mythology, adapted Eastern Mediterranean motifs, and combined them with distinctly regional styles. Goldwork, bronze sculptures, and elaborate tomb paintings suggest a society deeply connected to trade networks stretching across the ancient world. This interconnectedness raises further questions. If the Etruscans were migrants, where is the archaeological trail of their journey? And if they were indigenous, how did they develop such wide-reaching cultural connections so early? In the absence of definitive answers, several alternative theories have emerged over time, each attempting to explain the origins of this enigmatic people. One proposal suggests that the Etruscans represent a fusion of multiple migrating groups arriving in Italy during the late Bronze Age collapse. In this scenario, no single origin exists. Instead, waves of displaced populations from the eastern Mediterranean and surrounding regions may have converged in Etruria, blending gradually into a unified cultural identity. Over generations, their shared practices, language evolution, and regional adaptation could have formed what later became recognized as the Etruscan civilization. Another perspective focuses on continuity rather than migration. Some researchers argue that the Etruscans may descend from earlier Italic populations who lived in the region long before 900 BC, with cultural changes emerging internally through trade and gradual external influence rather than sudden arrival. In this view, the Etruscans are not newcomers, but the visible expression of a much older and largely unrecorded cultural lineage. There are also more speculative interpretations, often discussed at the edges of historical debate. Some propose distant connections to Anatolia or the Aegean, not as direct migration routes, but as shared ancestral layers from even earlier prehistoric movements. Others point to genetic studies that show mixed ancestry patterns, suggesting that the Etruscans cannot be easily categorized as either fully local or fully foreign, but rather something in between, a population shaped by centuries of interaction, blending, and regional adaptation. Yet even genetic evidence, while illuminating, does not fully resolve the question. It describes composition, not origin. It reveals mixture, but not the first moment of emergence. And so the question remains partially suspended. At what point does a people become distinct enough to be called something new? Walking through the remnants of Etruscan tombs today, one is struck not only by what remains, but by what is missing. There are no founding epics, no preserved chronicles of migration, no definitive record of self-identification. Only art, objects, and architecture remain, silent witnesses to a culture that once thrived between myth and recorded history. And perhaps that is where the mystery deepens most. because unlike civilizations that carefully recorded their beginnings, the Etruscans appear to emerge already formed, fully developed, culturally rich, and structurally complex, as if they stepped into history without leaving a trace of their arrival. Were they the product of migration long forgotten by time? A native evolution that predates written memory? Or a convergence of peoples whose individual origins dissolved into a single, unified identity? Standing in the quiet landscapes of Etruria, where ancient tombs lie beneath modern fields and olive groves, the question does not demand an answer so much as it resists one. And as with so many mysteries layered across history, it lingers, not as a conclusion but as an open doorway into what we still do not fully understand. From the shadowed origins of the Etruscans, where identity itself seems to rise without a clear beginning, the narrative of ancient history shifts once again, this time eastward, toward the vast grasslands and windswept frontiers beyond the known edges of classical civilization. There, between the northern fringes of the Black Sea and the endless steppe horizons stretching into Central Asia, ancient sources describe a people who moved like a storm across continents, leaving behind traces of conflict, displacement, and sudden absence. They were known as the Cimmerians. In the early accounts of the ancient world, the Cimmerians appear not as a settled civilization, but as a force of movement, a people defined less by cities or monuments, and more by their absence of them. The Greek poet Homer briefly alluded to them in the Odyssey, describing a distant land shrouded in mist and perpetual darkness, so far north that the sun itself seemed absent. Whether this was symbolic or geographical remains uncertain, but it marks one of the earliest literary echoes of their existence. Centuries later, more structured accounts emerge. The historian Herodotus describes the Cimmerians as a nomadic people originally inhabiting the northern regions of the Black Sea, an area often associated with the vast Pontic steppe. According to his narrative, they were driven from their homeland by the expansion of another nomadic group, the Scythians, who pushed westward across the steppe in a wave of displacement that reshaped entire regions. In this telling, the Cimmerians were not simply destroyed, they were displaced. Forced to move southward through mountain passes and river valleys, they entered Anatolia and the fringes of the Near East. Their arrival is recorded in Assyrian inscriptions, where they appear under names such as Gimiri, described as fierce raiders who disrupted established kingdoms and unsettled border regions of empires already under strain. And yet, despite these records of conflict and movement, something unusual happens in the historical trail of the Cimmerians. They vanish, not in a single moment of destruction, but gradually, quietly, until their name fades from written record. There is no definitive account of their final defeat, no clearly documented assimilation, no singular event marking their disappearance from history. Instead, there is a gap, a thinning of references, a slow erosion of identity within the ancient world's fragmented archives. What became of them after they crossed into Anatolia? Did they disband under pressure from larger empires? Did they merge into local populations, losing their distinct identity over generations? Or did they continue moving, absorbed into the shifting mosaic of peoples that defined the ancient Near East? Archaeology offers clues, but not closure. In regions of modern-day eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, scattered material evidence suggests the presence of steppe-influenced cultures during the late 8th and 7th centuries BC. Certain weapon styles, burial practices, and horse-related artifacts hint at nomadic traditions consistent with steppe origins. Yet none of these findings can be definitively labeled as Cimmerian with certainty. They suggest influence, interaction, and movement, but not identity. This ambiguity has led to a range of interpretations. One widely accepted view is that the Cimmerians were gradually assimilated into neighboring cultures. As they migrated southward, they may have fragmented into smaller groups, each integrating into local societies across Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Near East. In this perspective, their disappearance is not a mystery of extinction, but of absorption, an identity dissolved through contact, intermarriage, and political transformation. Another interpretation suggests that Cimmerian was never a single unified identity in the modern sense. Instead, it may have been a term used by external civilizations to describe various nomadic groups moving across the northern frontier. In this case, the disappearance of the Cimmerians may reflect not the loss of a people, but the fading of a label, an ancient classification that ceased to be useful as political landscapes changed. But there are also more complex and less certain theories emerging from the edges of historical reconstruction. Some researchers propose that the Cimmerians did not disappear at all, but transformed into other historically attested groups over time. Connections have been suggested, cautiously and controversially, between Cimmerian movements and later populations in the Caucasus and Anatolia. However, these links remain speculative, based on linguistic echoes, geographic overlap, and interpretive patterns rather than definitive proof. Others suggest a more fragmented fate. In this view, the Cimmerians were never fully unified to begin with, but rather a coalition of tribes bound together by circumstance, war, displacement, and survival on the steppe frontier. Once their migration dispersed them, that unity dissolved, and what remained were scattered groups too small or too integrated to preserve a shared identity. Still, even these explanations leave something unresolved. Because what makes the Cimmerians particularly striking is not only their movement, but the way they exist at the edge of historical visibility. They appear suddenly in the records of empires like Neo-Assyrian Empire, disrupt established borders, and then fade from mention just as quickly. Unlike civilizations that leave behind architecture, written tradition, or continuous lineage, the Cimmerians exist almost entirely through the accounts of others, seen, recorded, and then lost. Was this disappearance simply the result of assimilation into larger cultures that absorbed them over time? Or does it reflect a deeper instability in how ancient civilizations recorded and defined peoples beyond their own borders? The geography associated with their movement adds another layer of uncertainty. The Black Sea region, the Caucasus Passes, and the Anatolian Plateau all form a complex network of routes through which migration could occur. In such landscapes, movement is constant, boundaries are fluid, and identities shift easily across generations. A people traveling through such terrain might change more in a single century than written records can capture. And yet, even in this fluidity, the silence of their final chapter remains striking. There are no later inscriptions confidently identifying the Cimmerians as a distinct group beyond the 7th century BC. No known royal records claiming their definitive defeat. No surviving cultural tradition that clearly preserves their name in continuous form. Only echoes, fragmented references scattered across languages, empires, and centuries. Standing at this point in the historical narrative, one is left with a pattern that repeats across ancient history. Emergence without origin, presence without stability, disappearance without conclusion. Were the Cimmerians truly erased by conquest or migration? Or did they simply change so completely in movement that history could no longer recognize them as the same people it once recorded? And perhaps the deeper question is not where they went, but how many other peoples, equally real, have passed through history in the same way, leaving behind only brief mentions in the records of others, before dissolving into silence that time never fully explains. As the story of the Cimmerians dissolves into the shifting movements of the ancient steppe, the narrative turns once more toward the rugged highlands of the Near East, where mountains rise like stone fortresses and deep valleys carve natural borders between empires. It is here, between the high plateaus surrounding Lake Van and the harsh volcanic landscapes of eastern Anatolia, that another civilization once held power, then vanished from the stage of history with a silence that still feels unfinished. This was the kingdom of Urartu. In the thin, cold air of the Armenian highlands, where snowcaps linger on mountain peaks even as valleys burn under summer sun, the ruins of Urartian fortresses still cling to rocky outcrops. Massive stone walls, carefully fitted without mortar, overlook steep cliffs and narrow passes. From these elevated strongholds, ancient watchtowers once surveyed a land defined by both strategic advantage and constant vulnerability. Rivers cut through the terrain, feeding fertile valleys, while mountain routes connected Urartu to powerful neighbors, Assyria to the south, Anatolian kingdoms to the west, and the broader Caucasus to the north. For a time in the 9th to 7th centuries BC, Urartu was a formidable regional power. Centered around Lake Van, it developed into a structured kingdom with fortified cities, administrative systems, and advanced hydraulic engineering. Kings such as Sarduri I and Argishti I left inscriptions carved into stone, declaring conquests, building projects, and the expansion of royal authority. These inscriptions, written in a language related to but distinct from Assyrian cuneiform traditions, provide one of the clearest voices of Urartu's presence in history. And yet, despite this clarity, the end of Urartu remains strangely opaque. Unlike empires that collapse in recorded defeat or are described in detail by their conquerors, Urartu seems to fade. Its inscriptions grow fewer. Its administrative records disappear. Its cities, once heavily fortified and carefully maintained, show signs of decline, abandonment, or transformation. By the late 7th century BC, Urartu is no longer mentioned as a unified political entity in the same way it once was. What happened to it? The most widely accepted explanation places Urartu's decline within a broader regional transformation. During this period, the Assyrian Empire, long a dominant force in the Near East, was itself collapsing under internal pressures and external invasions. As Assyria weakened, new powers emerged and old alliances shifted. The Medes expanded from the Iranian plateau, while Babylon rose once again in Mesopotamia. In this turbulent environment, Urartu found itself caught between larger forces reshaping the political landscape. Some Assyrian and Babylonian records hint at conflicts and raids affecting Urartian territory. Cities were attacked. Borders were destabilized. Trade routes became less secure. Over time, the administrative structure that had once held Urartu together appears to have fragmented. But these records are incomplete, and they do not describe a single decisive moment of destruction. Instead, what emerges is a slow unraveling. Archaeology supports this sense of gradual change rather than sudden collapse. Excavations at Urartian sites such as Tushpa, near modern Lake Van, and Erebuni reveal layers of occupation that become less organized over time. Fortresses that once showed careful maintenance begin to display signs of reduced activity. Storage facilities are less systematically used. Some areas appear partially abandoned while others are repurposed. But even this does not fully explain the disappearance of Urartu as a political identity. Because unlike some civilizations that are conquered and renamed, Urartu does not simply transition into a clearly defined successor state. Instead, its identity dissolves into later regional cultures. By the time of later classical and early historical accounts, the name Urartu is replaced in many contexts by Armenia, marking a shift not only in political structure, but in historical memory itself. How does a kingdom with inscriptions, fortresses, and kings leave behind so little clarity about its end? One theory suggests that Urartu did not fall in a single catastrophic event, but rather underwent internal transformation. Regional elites may have adapted to new political realities, shifting alliances and identities as external pressures increased. In such a scenario, Urartu as a centralized kingdom could have fragmented into smaller administrative regions, gradually losing its unified identity while its population continued under new cultural and political frameworks. This type of transformation is not uncommon in ancient history. Empires rarely disappear instantly. More often, they evolve into successor structures that gradually redefine themselves. But what makes Urartu unusual is the lack of a clearly documented transition. There is no single narrative that fully explains how its royal system dissolved into what followed. Another perspective considers environmental and economic pressures. The highlands of eastern Anatolia are resource-rich but geographically demanding. Maintaining large fortresses, irrigation systems, and administrative centers requires continuous coordination. Some researchers suggest that shifts in trade routes or agricultural productivity may have weakened the economic foundation that supported Urartian authority. If key resources became harder to control, political fragmentation would likely follow. Yet even this explanation leaves gaps. Urartu was known for its advanced hydraulic engineering, including canals and irrigation systems that transformed parts of the highlands into productive agricultural zones. These achievements suggest a level of technical adaptation that might have allowed it to withstand environmental fluctuations, at least for a time. So what changed? Some ancient sources hint at external invasions from northern and eastern groups during the late 7th century BC. Among these are references to nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples moving through the Caucasus and Anatolian frontiers. These movements coincide with broader regional instability, including the collapse of Assyrian dominance. However, the records are fragmented, and they do not clearly identify a single conquering force responsible for Urartu's end. Instead, they suggest a complex period of overlapping pressures, military, political, and social, rather than a singular invasion. This complexity has led some modern interpretations to consider whether Urartu's disappearance was not simply a fall, but a transformation absorbed into emerging identities. As new political entities formed in the region, older names may have been replaced, repurposed, or gradually forgotten. In this view, Urartu did not vanish so much as dissolve into the foundations of later cultures. But even this idea raises further questions. If Urartu transformed into something else, why does its earlier identity remain so distinct in inscriptions and archaeological remains? Why does its name not persist more clearly in later traditions? Language provides another layer of uncertainty. The Urartian language, distinct from neighboring Semitic and Indo-European languages, was used in royal inscriptions and administrative records. Yet it disappears relatively quickly from the historical record. Later inscriptions in the region shift toward other languages, reflecting changing administrative and cultural structures. This linguistic disappearance mirrors the political one, both fading without a clearly documented transition. And then there is the symbolic world of Urartu itself. Their inscriptions often emphasize construction, conquest, and divine favor. Kings present themselves as builders of order in a mountainous and fragmented landscape. Fortresses are not just military structures, but expressions of stability imposed upon a difficult terrain. Water systems, roads, and storage facilities reflect a civilization deeply invested in controlling and organizing its environment. When such a system begins to weaken, what does that say about the society that built it? Some interpretations suggest that Urartu's identity was closely tied to its centralized royal structure. If that structure weakened, the cultural cohesion it supported may have weakened with it. Without a strong central authority, regional identities could have become more prominent, gradually replacing the older political framework. But even this does not fully resolve the mystery. Because archaeological evidence does not show a single catastrophic collapse layer across all Urartian sites. Instead, it shows variation. Some locations decline earlier, others persist longer, and some appear to transition into new cultural phases. This uneven pattern suggests a process that was neither uniform nor centrally coordinated, which leads to a final, lingering question. Was Urartu's end even recognized as a fall by those who lived through it? Or was it experienced as a slow redefinition of identity that only appears as disappearance from the perspective of later history? Standing among the ruins today, where stone walls still overlook valleys carved by ancient rivers, it is difficult to identify a clear ending point. The fortresses remain, the inscriptions endure, and the landscape has not forgotten the presence of those who once ruled it. But the kingdom itself, its name, its structure, its voice, has faded into historical silence. And so the question remains, embedded in the highlands where Urartu once stood. When a kingdom disappears without a single moment of collapse, does it truly fall? Or does it simply change into something history no longer recognizes? As the silence of Urartu settles into the stone-lined valleys of the Armenian highlands, the narrative drifts onward once again, away from mountain fortresses and collapsing kingdoms, and back toward the broader pattern that keeps emerging across ancient history. Civilizations do not always end with fire or conquest. Sometimes they dissolve gradually, their names fading long before their presence is truly gone. And in that fading, a deeper question begins to take shape. How many endings in history are actually transitions we have not fully understood? Beyond the highland ruins of Urartu, the landscape changes again. Rivers descend from the mountains into wider plains, eventually feeding into the great river systems that once supported the earliest urban civilizations. Here, where geography softens into fertile corridors and open lowlands, history becomes denser, layered with successive cultures building upon one another. Cities rise, are abandoned, and are rebuilt again on the same ground, each layer preserving fragments of what came before. In such regions, disappearance rarely means total erasure. It often means absorption. Urartu's final centuries appear to reflect exactly this kind of transformation. As political control weakens, regional centers begin to assert more autonomy. Fortified sites that once operated under a unified royal system start to reflect local variations in material culture. Administrative cohesion fragments, and with it, the ability to maintain a singular identity across the kingdom. But fragmentation does not necessarily mean collapse. It can also mean redistribution. Some archaeological interpretations suggest that Urartian populations may have gradually integrated into emerging regional identities. Instead of a sudden disappearance, there may have been a slow blending of traditions, languages, and administrative systems. The continuity of settlement in many Urartian regions supports this idea. People remained, even if the political structure above them changed. Yet even if populations continued, the question remains. Why does Urartu itself vanish as a named kingdom so abruptly from later historical memory? One possible answer lies in the way history is recorded. Much of what we know about Urartu comes from external sources: Assyrian inscriptions, Babylonian records, and later Greek references. When these sources shift their attention to new political powers, older entities can quickly recede into the background. The disappearance of a name in historical texts does not always reflect a disappearance on the ground, but a change in narrative focus. As new empires rise in the region, they bring new frameworks of identity. Territories once described under Urartian control begin to appear under different designations. Over time, the older name becomes less relevant to those writing the records, even if the people and places it once described continue in transformed ways. But this explanation still leaves a lingering tension. Because Urartu was not a marginal or minor kingdom. It was a structured, literate, and architecturally advanced state. Its inscriptions were deliberate acts of memory, stone declarations meant to endure. And yet, Despite this intention, its final chapter remains indistinct. There is no single inscription marking its end, no definitive royal proclamation of collapse, no universally agreed historical breakpoint. Instead, there is silence. And in that silence, speculation inevitably begins to grow, not as fantasy, but as attempts to fill the gaps left by incomplete records. Some interpretations suggest that internal political fragmentation may have played a central role. In this view, Urartu's strength was closely tied to its centralized monarchy and fortified administrative centers. If royal authority weakened, regional governors may have gradually asserted independence, creating a patchwork of smaller polities where once there was a unified kingdom. Over time, the identity of Urartu may have become less relevant than the local identities that replaced it. Others consider the possibility of external pressure accelerating this fragmentation. The late 7th century BC was a period of significant upheaval across the Near East. The collapse of long-standing imperial systems created openings for new powers and movements of people. In such a context, even a stable kingdom could experience rapid destabilization if trade routes, alliances, or military balances shifted suddenly. Yet even these models do not produce a clean ending. What they describe is a process, slow, uneven, and difficult to define in a single moment. Which raises another question. Why does history often seek clear endings for processes that were never truly singular events? The archaeological record reflects this ambiguity. Some Urartian sites show continued occupation into later periods, though with altered material culture. Architectural styles shift. Administrative practices change. New cultural influences appear layered over older ones, creating a gradual transformation rather than a clear break. In some regions, continuity is especially visible. Settlements persist in the same locations, suggesting that populations remained rooted even as political structures evolved around them. This continuity complicates the idea of fall as a simple disappearance. Instead, it suggests adaptation, communities adjusting to new realities while maintaining aspects of older traditions. But adaptation does not erase identity. It reshapes it. And so the question becomes less about whether Urartu ended and more about how it changed, and why that change is not clearly documented in its own voice. Unlike civilizations that left extensive narrative histories, Urartu's surviving records are primarily royal inscriptions. These texts emphasize victories, construction, and divine legitimacy. They are designed to project stability, not record decline. This means that even if internal instability existed, it may not have been recorded in the surviving inscriptions. In that sense, the silence at the end of Urartu may not be accidental, it may be structural. The very nature of its written record may have been intended to preserve authority rather than chronicle its dissolution. And when authority fades, so too does the record that depended on it. There is also the question of memory beyond written sources. Later cultures in the region inherited and reinterpreted elements of Urartian infrastructure, language fragments, and architectural techniques. But the name itself gradually disappears from active use. It becomes an archaeological and historical term rather than a living identity. This transition, from lived identity to reconstructed history, is one of the most subtle yet profound shifts in ancient narratives. It marks the point where a civilization stops being self-defined and becomes defined by others. And yet, even in disappearance, traces remain. Stone walls still stand against the wind in the highlands. Inscriptions still carve out names of kings who once believed their words would endure forever. Irrigation channels still follow paths shaped by Urartian engineering. The physical world retains memory even when textual identity fades. So what does it mean for a kingdom to fall if its structures persist in altered form? Perhaps the fall of Urartu is not a singular event, but a long transition, one that unfolded across generations, too gradual to be captured in a single historical moment, yet too complex to be reduced to simple continuity. And as we step back from the highlands and look at the wider pattern across ancient history, a recurring theme emerges. Civilizations rarely vanish completely. They shift, merge, fragment, and transform until the name once used to define them no longer matches the reality that remains. Which leaves us with a final, lingering question suspended over the ruins and valleys of eastern Anatolia. When a kingdom disappears from its own name but not from its land, where exactly does its history go? As the traces of Urartu fade into the layered silence of the Anatolian highlands, the narrative moves once more toward the wider arc of ancient empires, toward a civilization that rose with extraordinary speed, reshaped the known world of its time, and then left behind a legacy both monumental and strangely incomplete. To the east, beyond the highlands and river valleys, the landscape opens into vast plateaus and desert edges that stretch toward the heart of ancient Persia. Here, in the region that once formed the core of the Achaemenid Empire, the story of Cyrus the Great begins to take shape, not only as a ruler of immense historical significance, but as a figure whose final resting place remains known, yet whose treasures remain elusive. The tomb attributed to Cyrus the Great stands in the archaeological site of Pasargadae, in modern-day Iran. It is a stark, elegant structure of pale limestone blocks, rising in stepped formation above the surrounding plain. Unlike the grand monumental complexes of later Persian kings, this tomb is striking in its simplicity. A small chamber rests atop a six-tiered stone base, isolated in a windswept landscape that feels almost deliberately quiet. There are no elaborate carvings, no overwhelming ornamentation, only geometry, proportion, and stillness. And yet, despite its modest exterior, ancient accounts suggest that what once rested within this structure carried immense symbolic and material value. Cyrus the Great, who ruled in the 6th century BC, founded the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires of the ancient world. His rule extended across a vast and diverse territory, from the Iranian plateau to Anatolia and beyond. He is remembered in various historical traditions as a ruler who combined military expansion with administrative innovation, allowing conquered regions a degree of cultural and religious continuity unprecedented for his time. When he died around 530 BC, ancient sources describe a burial of great significance. Some accounts suggest that his body was placed within a golden sarcophagus, surrounded by treasures, royal regalia, and ceremonial objects reflecting the power of his reign. His tomb at Pasargadae was reportedly maintained with great care in the early centuries following his death, even visited by later rulers who revered his legacy. But what exactly lay inside that tomb, and where those treasures are now, remains one of the quieter, less understood mysteries of the ancient world. Unlike some other royal burials of antiquity, Cyrus's tomb does not present obvious signs of dramatic destruction. The structure itself still stands, though time has weathered its surface. Yet historical records describing its contents become increasingly uncertain over centuries. Later accounts suggest that the tomb was opened or disturbed at some point in antiquity, but the details are fragmented, inconsistent, and often written long after the events they describe. What happened to the treasures that may have once been placed within? Some ancient traditions imply that the tomb remained intact for a time, protected by reverence for Cyrus's legacy. Greek historians writing after the rise of the Achaemenid Empire describe the site as a place of respect, even admiration, where inscriptions and guards may have preserved its sanctity. But as political power shifted across the region, through Alexander's campaigns, the Seleucid period, and later Parthian and Sasanian eras, the continuity of protection becomes harder to trace, and with each passing century, the clarity of the record begins to fade. One widely discussed possibility is that the tomb was eventually entered during a period of political instability. Ancient imperial transitions often involved the redistribution or appropriation of royal wealth, and tombs were not always immune to such disruptions. If Cyrus's burial chamber contained significant treasures, it is conceivable that later powers may have removed or relocated them, either for symbolic legitimacy or material value. But no definitive record survives to confirm such an event. Instead, there is silence, broken only by indirect references and later interpretations. Archaeological study of the tomb itself reveals no clear evidence of large-scale looting in the modern sense. The structure is relatively simple, and the burial chamber is small. This has led some researchers to question whether the legendary descriptions of vast treasures may have been symbolic rather than literal. In ancient royal tradition, accounts of gold, regalia, and precious objects often served as expressions of status rather than precise inventories. Could it be that the lost treasures were never physically extensive, but instead exaggerated through centuries of storytelling? Yet this interpretation does not fully resolve the tension between tradition and physical evidence. Cyrus was not an ordinary ruler. As the founder of a vast empire, his burial would likely have held significant ceremonial importance. Even if symbolic exaggeration played a role in later accounts, it does not entirely eliminate the possibility that valuable objects were placed within or around the tomb. Another perspective considers the possibility that the treasures were relocated intentionally. Some ancient burial practices involved secondary ceremonies or the movement of royal goods to safeguard them during times of unrest. If such practices were applied at any point in the centuries following Cyrus's death, the original contents of the tomb could have been dispersed, hidden, or incorporated into other royal repositories. But if that were the case, where did they go? The Achaemenid Empire itself eventually fell to Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. Ancient sources describe Alexander visiting Pasargadae and paying respects to Cyrus's tomb. Some accounts suggest he ordered repairs to the structure, recognizing its symbolic importance. Yet even during this period of documented reverence, there is no clear inventory of what remained inside the tomb. Later still, the region passed through successive empires, each with its own relationship to the memory of Cyrus. The Parthians and Sasanians, who ruled much of the same territory in later centuries, inherited fragments of Achaemenid legacy, but often reinterpreted it through their own cultural frameworks. Over time, the direct historical connection to the original burial practices becomes increasingly indirect. And so the question persists, not only about what was lost, but about when it was lost. Some speculative interpretations suggest that the treasures may have been deliberately removed and hidden during periods of conflict, possibly to prevent desecration. In such a scenario, the absence of records could itself be a form of protection. Valuable objects might have been dispersed across different locations, absorbed into other royal collections, or concealed in ways that left no clear archaeological trace. Others consider a more symbolic reading, that the true treasure of Cyrus's tomb was never meant to be material wealth at all, but rather the legacy of imperial structure he left behind. In this view, the emphasis on gold and riches in later accounts reflects the way memory transforms leadership into myth, gradually converting political authority into legendary imagery. Yet even this interpretation does not fully settle the mystery, because the tomb itself remains real. It exists in physical space, anchored in the landscape of Pasargadae, continuing to mark the presence of a ruler whose influence reshaped the ancient world. The simplicity of the structure contrasts sharply with the magnitude of the empire it represents, creating a tension between physical modesty and historical scale. Standing before it, one is confronted not with absence, but with reduction, an empire distilled into a single stone chamber. And that raises another question. If the tomb of Cyrus the Great was meant to preserve memory, why does it leave so little clarity about what it once contained? Perhaps the uncertainty is not accidental. Perhaps it reflects the nature of memory itself, especially in ancient worlds where written records were selective, preservation was uneven, and oral traditions evolved across generations. What is remembered is not always what was most accurately recorded, but what remained meaningful enough to be retold. In that sense, the lost tomb treasures may exist in a space between history and narrative, where material fact and cultural memory overlap without fully aligning. Archaeology continues to study Pasargadae, carefully documenting the structure and its surroundings. Yet no hidden chambers have been conclusively identified, and no definitive evidence of large-scale burial wealth has been recovered. The tomb remains both present and incomplete in its story, visible to the eye, but silent in its original contents. And so the mystery remains suspended in the quiet landscape of ancient Persia. Was the tomb of Cyrus the Great once filled with treasures that were lost to time, removed by human hands, or never as extensive as later tradition suggests? Or does its enduring simplicity hint at a different kind of legacy, one that cannot be measured in objects at all, but only in the empire that once stretched outward from this single quiet stone structure? As the question of Cyrus the Great's tomb lingers in the silence of Pasargadae, the narrative does not close. It shifts again, as if history itself refuses to stay still. From the stillness of a single stone structure, the focus expands outward, following the fading trails of memory across empires that rose in its wake. The winds that move through the plain where Cyrus was buried do not simply pass over ruins. They pass over centuries of reinterpretation. Kings after kings, each in turn looking back at the Achaemenid legacy, trying to position themselves within its shadow. Some honored it, some repurposed it, and others quietly absorbed it into new narratives of power. And in that process, the clarity of what once belonged to Cyrus, his burial, his possessions, his immediate legacy, becomes increasingly difficult to separate from later layers of meaning. In ancient historical tradition, royal tombs were never just resting places. They were symbols of legitimacy, anchors of authority stretching beyond death. To control a tomb was, in a sense, to control memory. And memory, in the ancient world, was often more politically powerful than material wealth. This is where the mystery of Cyrus's lost treasures deepens, not simply in the question of what was buried, but in what was remembered, reinterpreted, or removed from memory altogether. As centuries passed after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Pasargadae remained known, but its role changed. The region was no longer the center of imperial authority. New capitals emerged, new dynasties rose, and the physical landscape of power shifted. In such transitions, older sites often moved from active political spaces into symbolic ones, visited, referenced, but no longer fully preserved in their original function. And in that shift, the physical integrity of royal sites often becomes vulnerable not only to decay, but to reinterpretation. Some later accounts suggest that the tomb of Cyrus was visited by conquerors and rulers who recognized its significance. Alexander the Great is often associated with such visits in historical tradition, portrayed as someone who engaged with the memory of Cyrus with a degree of respect. Yet even these accounts, written by later historians, do not provide a clear picture of what remained inside the tomb at that time. Reverence does not necessarily mean preservation. Recognition does not guarantee protection. So the question persists quietly beneath the surface of history. If the tomb was seen, was it also intact? Archaeology offers only partial guidance here. The structure at Pasargadae shows no obvious signs of dramatic destruction in the modern sense. There are no visible indications of catastrophic collapse or large-scale structural violation. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Ancient disturbances, especially those involving burial sites, do not always leave clear architectural scars. A chamber can be entered, contents removed, and structure left outwardly unchanged. This possibility introduces a different kind of uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of myth, but the uncertainty of incomplete traces. And yet another layer complicates the picture: the evolution of storytelling itself. As centuries passed, descriptions of royal burials across the ancient world often became increasingly elaborate in retelling. Wealth, symbolism, and power tended to accumulate in narrative form even when physical evidence remained limited. Gold coffins, vast hoards, ceremonial objects. These details appear repeatedly in traditions surrounding powerful rulers, sometimes without corresponding archaeological confirmation. In this context, the treasures of Cyrus may reflect not only historical reality, but also the way later cultures expressed reverence for imperial founders. But even if symbolism played a role in shaping the narrative, it does not fully dissolve the mystery. Because Cyrus was not merely a legendary figure, he was a historically attested ruler who reshaped the political geography of the ancient Near East. His empire extended across vast territories, integrating diverse cultures and administrative systems. Such a ruler would almost certainly have had access to extraordinary wealth, collected through tribute, trade, and conquest. The question is not whether wealth existed in his time, but what became of it in death. Some interpretations suggest that royal treasures were not always intended to remain permanently within tombs. In certain ancient traditions, burial practices could involve offerings that were symbolic rather than permanent, or objects that were later redistributed among successors. If such practices were applied, then the idea of a sealed, permanent hoard may itself be a later simplification of more complex funerary customs. Others consider the possibility that political instability played a direct role in the disappearance of any original burial contents. The region that once formed the heart of the Achaemenid world did not remain politically static. Successive empires, each with their own administrative systems and cultural priorities, controlled the same territories over time. In such conditions, the relocation, repurposing, or loss of royal objects becomes entirely plausible, even if never explicitly recorded. Yet despite these possibilities, no definitive archaeological cache linked directly to Cyrus's burial has ever been discovered. This absence is itself part of the mystery. Because Pasargadae is not an unexplored site, it has been studied, mapped, and examined across generations of archaeological inquiry. And still, the internal story of the tomb, its original contents, its early history after burial, its potential disturbances, remains incomplete. The structure stands, but its interior narrative is largely silent. That silence invites another perspective: the idea that the significance of Cyrus's tomb may not lie in what it contained, but in what it represented to those who came after him. For later rulers and cultures, Cyrus became a foundational figure, a model of kingship, governance, and imperial organization. His memory was preserved not only in physical sites, but in ideological frameworks. In this sense, the tomb functions as a focal point of remembrance, regardless of what material objects may or may not have originally been placed within it. But even symbolic importance does not erase the human curiosity about what once lay inside. It is difficult to stand before a structure like the tomb at Pasargadae and not imagine what might have been enclosed within its stone chamber at the moment of burial. Objects of authority, personal artifacts, items of ritual significance, or perhaps something far simpler than tradition suggests. The mind naturally fills silence with structure, especially when that silence is preserved in stone. And so the mystery persists, not loudly, but quietly, embedded in the landscape itself. Was the tomb of Cyrus the Great once filled with treasures that were later removed, dispersed, or lost through the shifting tides of empire? Or has the idea of those treasures grown over time, shaped more by the way civilizations remember their founders than by what was actually placed within the chamber? As Pasargadae continues to stand in the open air of modern Iran, exposed to wind, light, and centuries of interpretation, the answer remains just out of reach, not hidden in legend alone, but in the space between history, memory, and the things that time refuses to fully reveal. As the memory of Cyrus the Great settles into the stone silence of Pasargadae, the narrative shifts once more, away from royal tombs and imperial legacies, and toward a place where history was never written as certainty, but spoken as prophecy. High above the plains of central Greece, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the landscape rises in steep, fractured layers of limestone and shadow. Olive trees cling to the rocky terrain, and narrow paths wind upward toward one of the most enigmatic sanctuaries of the ancient world, Delphi. Even today, the site carries a strange atmosphere of suspension, as if the mountain itself is still listening. Here, among collapsing columns and partially reconstructed foundations, once stood the sanctuary of Apollo and the famed Oracle of Delphi, a place where words were believed to carry the voice of the divine. But beneath the ruins of temples and treasuries lies another, less visible mystery. Not what was spoken here, but what was lost. The Oracle of Delphi was not a single person in the way modern imagination often simplifies it, but a system, a sacred institution centered around a priestess known as the Pythia, who delivered cryptic utterances believed to be inspired by Apollo. Ancient sources describe her seated within the inner chamber of the temple, the Adyton, where she would enter a trance-like state before speaking responses that were then interpreted by priestly attendants. For centuries, rulers, generals, and ordinary citizens traveled across the Mediterranean world to seek guidance here. Decisions of war, colonization, diplomacy, and personal fate were shaped by the words attributed to Delphi. The sanctuary became one of the most influential centers of decision-making in the ancient world, not through force, but through interpretation. And yet, despite its immense cultural importance, no complete archive of its spoken prophecies survives. What exactly was lost? Ancient writers make repeated references to oracular responses being recorded, preserved, and consulted. Some accounts suggest that official records of prophecies were kept within the sanctuary itself, possibly inscribed or stored in dedicated temple archives. Others imply that selected oracles were recorded by city-states that received them, integrated into civic memory or preserved in public inscriptions. If such records once existed in systematic form, then where did they go? The sanctuary at Delphi endured for centuries, surviving wars, political shifts, and changing religious landscapes. It was respected even by rival powers, including those who otherwise challenged Greek religious traditions. Its influence extended into the classical period, where figures such as kings and generals sought its counsel before major decisions. But over time, the continuity of its institutional memory begins to fragment. By the late classical and early Hellenistic periods, references to Delphi become more symbolic, less administrative. The oracle remains active in tradition, but the detailed institutional structure behind it becomes less clearly documented. Then, gradually, the physical and textual traces begin to thin. When the Roman world later absorbed much of Greek religious culture, Delphi was still recognized, still visited, still referenced. But by then, the earlier layers of record-keeping, if they existed in centralized form, were no longer intact in any recoverable way. Fires, earthquakes, political transitions, and religious transformations all contributed to the gradual loss of material archives across the ancient Mediterranean. Yet Delphi's case feels different, because unlike many ancient sites where records simply decay or scatter, Delphi was considered a place of preservation. It was a sacred center, a repository of divine communication. If any institution in the ancient world might have maintained structured archives of prophetic statements, it would have been here. And so the absence becomes more noticeable. Some ancient testimonies hint at written compilations of oracles, sometimes referenced in political or historical contexts. Certain historians suggest that collections of prophetic sayings were consulted by later generations, possibly organized in ways that allowed patterns to be studied or referenced. But these collections do not survive in full. Only fragments, references, and later quotations remain. This raises a question that continues to echo through historical scholarship. Were the lost records destroyed, dispersed, or never centralized in the way later tradition implies? One interpretation suggests that the oral nature of the oracle was fundamental to its function. In this view, the power of Delphi did not depend on fixed textual archives, but on spoken ambiguity, prophecies designed to be interpreted, reinterpreted, and adapted to changing circumstances. If this were the case, then the lack of surviving records may not represent loss, but intention. But even within oral systems, societies often preserve at least partial documentation. And archaeological excavations at Delphi have uncovered inscriptions, dedications, and administrative records related to the sanctuary's economic and political life. These show that writing was present, used, and valued within the broader context of the site. So why do the prophetic records themselves remain elusive? Some scholars suggest that selective preservation may have played a role. Prophecies that were politically successful or culturally significant could have been recorded and displayed, while others may have been discarded, forgotten, or intentionally left unrecorded to preserve the authority of future interpretations. In such a system, only fragments would survive over time, not as a complete archive, but as scattered references embedded in other texts. Others consider the possibility that records were deliberately removed or destroyed during periods of political or religious transition. As philosophical schools evolved and new forms of rational inquiry developed in the classical world, the role of oracles began to shift. What was once central to decision-making gradually became symbolic, ritualistic, or ceremonial. In such transitions, older institutional records sometimes lose their perceived value and are not preserved with the same urgency. But even this does not fully explain the depth of absence. Because Delphi was not marginal. It was central. Its influence shaped decisions across city-states and empires. If comprehensive records of its pronouncements once existed, their disappearance represents not just a local loss, but a significant gap in the intellectual history of the ancient Mediterranean world. And so the mystery deepens. Archaeology at Delphi has revealed a complex sanctuary. Temples rebuilt across centuries, treasuries constructed by different city-states, inscriptions dedicating offerings to Apollo, and pathways carved for pilgrims ascending the sacred slope. The physical site speaks clearly of its importance, yet the spoken dimension, the content of the oracle itself, remains largely inaccessible. What survives are indirect echoes. Later historians sometimes quote or paraphrase oracular statements, embedding them within narratives of wars, migrations, and political decisions. These fragments suggest that the oracle often spoke in layered, ambiguous language, phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on outcome. This ambiguity itself may have been essential to its enduring authority. A prophecy that can adapt to events retains relevance across time. But ambiguity also complicates preservation. If meaning is fluid, then fixed textual representation becomes inherently unstable. Still, one question remains difficult to dismiss. If Delphi was consulted so widely, why is there no more substantial surviving archive of its communications? Some interpretations suggest that knowledge at Delphi was intentionally decentralized. Rather than a single archive, Records may have been distributed among priests, city-states, and temple officials, creating a fragmented system of memory. In such a model, no single repository would survive intact because no single repository fully existed. Another perspective considers the role of catastrophe. The sanctuary endured earthquakes and periods of destruction across its long history. Physical damage to buildings is well documented. If archives were stored within temple structures, even partial destruction could have resulted in irreversible loss. Yet again, this remains speculative, as no definitive archival chamber has been identified. And then there is the possibility that what modern eyes interpret as lost records may never have been conceived as a unified archive in the first place. Ancient systems of knowledge were often distributed, contextual, and embedded in social practice rather than centralized documentation. In such a framework, the oracle's authority would not depend on preservation, but on continual renewal through ritual. But even if this is true, it does not diminish the sense of absence. Because Delphi was more than a religious site. It was a decision-making center for the ancient world, a place where uncertainty was formalized into guidance. Kings, city-states, and individuals sought clarity here. And yet, the record of that guidance survives only in fragments, scattered across later texts and inscriptions. Standing among the ruins today, the temple foundations are visible, the pathways still traceable, the mountain still imposing. But the voice that once defined the site is gone. Or perhaps not gone, but transformed. Because the oracle's words, whether preserved or lost, continue to exist in the decisions they influenced, in the wars they preceded, and in the histories they shaped. Even without a complete archive, their impact remains embedded in the trajectory of ancient civilization. And when that language disappears, what exactly remains? Across the ancient Mediterranean world, Delphi was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader landscape of sacred sites, divination centers, and interpretive traditions that shaped decision-making across civilizations. Yet Delphi stood apart in both prestige and reach. Its influence extended far beyond Greece, consulted by distant city-states, colonial ventures, and even emerging empires seeking legitimacy in moments of crisis. But influence, no matter how vast, does not guarantee preservation. The surviving references to Delphi's oracular pronouncements are scattered like broken reflections in a fractured mirror. A line quoted by a historian here, a paraphrased warning recorded there, a political decision later attributed to divine instruction. Each fragment suggests a larger body of knowledge that once existed in structured form, but the structure itself is gone. What kind of system produces such fragmentation? One possibility lies in the nature of interpretation itself. The Oracle of Delphi did not function like a modern archive or a written database of predictions. Its power rested in ambiguity, statements shaped in language that could shift meaning depending on context, outcome, and retrospective understanding. A prophecy fulfilled could be emphasized and preserved. One that failed or lost relevance might quietly disappear from collective record. In this sense, the lost records may not represent a single destroyed archive, but a selective memory shaped by centuries of reinterpretation. Yet even selective memory requires some foundation, and ancient sources repeatedly suggest that written material associated with Delphi did exist in some capacity. Temple dedications, administrative records, and offerings were clearly documented. The sanctuary itself was deeply integrated into the civic and political structures of the Greek world, suggesting that literacy and record-keeping were not absent from its function. So why does the prophetic core remain so elusive? As centuries passed, the sanctuary itself underwent transformation. The classical Greek world gave way to Hellenistic kingdoms, then Roman administration. Each shift brought new cultural frameworks, new priorities, and new interpretations of older traditions. Sacred spaces were reused, reinterpreted, and sometimes physically altered. In such transitions, older layers of institutional memory often become vulnerable, not necessarily through deliberate destruction, but through gradual displacement. Texts that were once central can become peripheral. Records that once guided decisions can become ceremonial artifacts. And over time, what was once a living system of knowledge can dissolve into symbolic reference. At Delphi, this process appears especially pronounced. The sanctuary remained active for centuries, but its earlier institutional depth becomes increasingly difficult to trace in later periods. Roman writers still reference the oracle, but often through the lens of cultural admiration or historical curiosity, rather than active consultation. The shift from decision-making authority to symbolic heritage is subtle, but significant. And in that shift, preservation priorities change. Some scholars propose that key documents may have been relocated during periods of instability, moved to other administrative or religious centers where they were later lost, absorbed, or repurposed. Others suggest that the decentralized nature of ancient record-keeping meant that no single archive ever contained the full body of oracular output, making complete preservation structurally unlikely from the beginning. But even these explanations do not fully account for the sense of absence that surrounds Delphi today. Because what is missing is not only data, it is continuity. The idea that generations once traveled to a single place to receive structured divine guidance implies a system of accumulated knowledge, a growing repository of interpreted wisdom. And yet, that accumulation has not survived in any coherent form. Instead, what remains is a series of isolated glimpses, each separated from the next by gaps that cannot easily be bridged. Archaeology at Delphi reveals a site of extraordinary complexity. Temples rebuilt across centuries, treasuries constructed by competing city-states, inscriptions marking dedications, victories, and offerings. The physical evidence of importance is overwhelming, and yet the intellectual core, the actual content of the oracle's voice, remains absent. It is as if the stage remains, but the script has been lost. This absence has led to another line of interpretation, one that views the oracle not as a system dependent on preserved records, but as a continuously evolving performance of interpretation. In this view, the authority of Delphi resided not in fixed statements, but in the act of delivery itself. The ritual, the trance, the ambiguity, and the communal process of making meaning from uncertainty. If that is the case, then the loss of records is not a failure of preservation, but a reflection of how the system functioned. And yet, even this interpretation does not fully resolve the tension. Because ancient societies did preserve other forms of sacred knowledge with remarkable continuity. Hymns, ritual instructions, and religious texts survived across generations in various contexts. So why would the most influential prophetic center of the ancient world leave behind such a fragmented textual footprint? Some suggest that secrecy played a role, that certain aspects of the oracle's function were intentionally restricted to oral transmission, controlled by priestly authorities who maintained interpretive power through limited disclosure. In such a structure, writing may have existed only in partial form, enough to guide practice, but not enough to reconstruct the system externally. Others consider the possibility of physical loss through catastrophe. Earthquakes, fires, and structural collapses are well documented at Delphi across its long history. A single destructive event affecting storage areas or temple archives could have erased materials that were never widely duplicated elsewhere. But again, no definitive archaeological evidence of a central destroyed archive has been identified. The truth may lie somewhere between these models, not a single cause, but a convergence of practices, transformations, and losses over time. What remains undeniable is the enduring influence of Delphi's oracular tradition, even in its fragmented state. Decisions once attributed to its guidance shaped colonization patterns, military campaigns, and political alliances. Entire historical trajectories were influenced by interpretations of its words. And yet the original formulations behind those decisions are largely inaccessible. We are left with outcomes, but not the full chain of spoken reasoning that produced them. This creates a unique historical inversion, a system that profoundly shaped the ancient world, yet survives only through indirect reference and interpretive echo. And so Delphi becomes less a repository of answers, and more a symbol of structured uncertainty. Standing among its ruins today, the visitor sees stone foundations, weathered columns, and the outline of a sanctuary that once mediated between human decision and perceived divine will. But the voice that once defined its authority is no longer present in any recoverable form. It exists only in fragments, citations, paraphrases, inherited traditions, and the silence between them, which leaves a final question suspended in the stillness of the mountain. If a place once held the power to shape the decisions of the ancient world through spoken words, but those words no longer survive in their original form, then what exactly has been lost? The records themselves, or the ability to fully understand how meaning was once created there? As the silence of Delphi settles into the mountains of Greece, the narrative shifts once again, this time moving eastward, back toward the ancient heartlands of Mesopotamia, where empires did not merely rise and fall, but accumulated wealth on a scale that still feels almost unimaginable. Here, along the broad plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where cities once shimmered beneath heat and dust, stood the Neo-Assyrian capital of Nineveh. In the 7th century BC, this was one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world, vast in scale, heavily fortified, and filled with palaces whose walls were lined with carved reliefs depicting conquest, tribute, and royal authority. And within this world of overwhelming imperial display, one name stands out with particular weight: Sennacherib. Sennacherib, king of Assyria from 705 to 681 BC, ruled over an empire that stretched across much of the Near East. His reign is remembered for military campaigns, ambitious construction projects, and the transformation of Nineveh into a capital of monumental grandeur. Ancient inscriptions describe vast building works, including palaces, aqueducts, and defensive walls that reshaped the city into a symbol of imperial dominance. But among these accounts lies a quieter, more elusive mystery, not about conquest, but about what was lost. The missing treasures of Sennacherib are not described in a single unified record. Instead, they emerge indirectly, through fragments of historical accounts, archaeological gaps, and references to immense wealth accumulated during his reign. The Assyrian Empire was known for extracting tribute from conquered regions: gold, silver, precious stones, textiles, and crafted objects flowing continuously into the royal treasury. Over decades of expansion, such wealth would have been concentrated in the imperial centers, particularly Nineveh. And yet, when the empire collapses, that accumulated wealth seems to vanish from the historical record. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BC, brought about by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and other regional powers, is one of the most dramatic events in ancient Near Eastern history. Ancient sources describe the city's destruction in stark terms: palaces burned, walls breached, and the political center of Assyrian power brought to an end. Archaeological layers confirm widespread destruction at this time, marked by ash, collapsed structures, and signs of intense conflict. But destruction alone does not fully explain what happened to the empire's vast stores of wealth. Assyria was not a minor kingdom with limited resources. It was an imperial system built on continuous extraction of tribute from a wide network of territories. Royal treasuries, storehouses, and palatial complexes would have contained enormous quantities of material wealth at the time of collapse. So the question arises, where did it all go? Some of the wealth may have been destroyed in the fires that accompanied the city's fall. Palaces constructed of mud brick and wood would have been highly vulnerable to burning structures collapsing inward, burying objects beneath debris. Precious materials could have been melted, scattered, or rendered unrecognizable amid the destruction. But fire alone does not account for everything. Archaeological excavations in Nineveh and surrounding sites have uncovered extensive remains of the city's destruction layer, but surprisingly limited evidence of large centralized hoards of treasure. For an empire of such magnitude, the absence is notable. It suggests either that wealth was not concentrated in a single location at the time of collapse, or that significant portions were removed before or during the final destruction. This leads to one of the central uncertainties. Was the wealth of Sennacherib's empire already dispersed before Nineveh fell? Some historical interpretations suggest that as the Neo-Assyrian Empire weakened in its final decades, administrative control may have fractured. Regional governors and military leaders could have redirected resources to local strongholds. In such a scenario, imperial wealth would not have remained centralized, but would have been gradually redistributed across the collapsing political structure. Another possibility involves rapid evacuation during the final stages of siege warfare. Ancient accounts describe prolonged conflict surrounding Nineveh before its fall. In moments of impending defeat, it is conceivable that portions of the royal treasury were moved, hidden, or transported elsewhere. However, the scale of such an operation under siege conditions would have been difficult, and there is no surviving record detailing organized removal of imperial wealth. And so the mystery deepens. Because unlike smaller kingdoms or isolated sites, Assyria was a highly bureaucratic state. Its administration was extensive, its record-keeping system sophisticated, and its control over resources highly structured. Royal inscriptions document tributes received from distant regions, lists of conquered cities, and descriptions of wealth flowing into the empire. Yet there is a striking absence of corresponding records detailing the fate of those accumulated resources at the moment of collapse. The silence is not just archaeological, it is documentary. Some scholars propose that later empires may have repurposed or absorbed portions of Assyrian wealth. The Babylonians, who played a major role in the fall of Nineveh, would have inherited both territory and material resources. In ancient warfare, the redistribution of captured wealth was common practice. Treasures could have been divided among victorious powers, incorporated into new administrative systems, or melted down and recast into new forms of state wealth. But if that were the case, why is there so little clear trace of such an enormous transfer? Another line of interpretation considers the possibility of systematic concealment. In times of collapse, elites sometimes attempt to hide wealth in secure locations, buried caches, concealed chambers, or remote storage sites intended for later recovery. Across the ancient Near East, there are examples of hidden hoards discovered centuries later, suggesting that such practices did occur. If similar actions took place during the fall of Assyria, then some portion of Sennacherib's accumulated wealth may still lie undiscovered. Yet despite extensive archaeological exploration in Mesopotamia, no definitive cache has been identified that can be directly linked to the royal treasury of Sennacherib's reign. There are also more interpretive perspectives that view the concept of missing treasures not as a literal single hoard, but as a metaphor for the fragmentation of imperial systems. In this reading, the wealth of Assyria did not disappear, it transformed. It was redistributed across successor states, absorbed into regional economies, and gradually integrated into new political structures. Over time, what once existed as centralized imperial wealth ceased to exist as a single identifiable entity. And yet, even this explanation leaves something unresolved. Because Assyria was not only an economic system, it was a symbol of concentrated power. Its kings represented authority on a scale that was deliberately visible material, and monumental. Palaces were not just administrative centers, they were expressions of dominance. To imagine that all of this accumulated wealth simply dispersed without leaving a clear historical trace creates a gap that is difficult to fully reconcile. Archaeology continues to reveal fragments of Assyrian grandeur, carved reliefs depicting tribute from distant lands, inscriptions recording military victories, and architectural remains of palatial complexes. But the physical accumulation of imperial wealth, the concentrated embodiment of centuries of expansion, remains elusive. It is as if the empire left behind its image, but not its substance. This raises a broader question about how ancient empires end. Is collapse a moment of destruction, or a process of redistribution so extensive that it erases the very concept of centralized accumulation? When a system built on continuous extraction dissolves, does its wealth vanish, or simply become indistinguishable from the new structures that replace it? Standing among the ruins of Nineveh today, the scale of what once existed is still visible in the ground itself. The outlines of palaces, the remnants of walls, the traces of burned structures all point to a civilization of immense capacity. And yet, the material evidence of its concentrated wealth remains incomplete. So the mystery persists, not as a single unanswered question, but as a series of overlapping uncertainties. Were Sennacherib's treasures destroyed in the final collapse of Nineveh? Were they dispersed across emerging kingdoms in the aftermath of war? Or were they hidden away, buried in locations that have yet to be uncovered, waiting silently beneath layers of time and earth? And perhaps the deeper question is not only what happened to the treasures themselves, but how an empire so powerful could leave behind such a fragmented trace of everything it once held. As the question of Sennacherib's missing treasures lingers in the broken layers of Nineveh, the story does not truly end. It shifts again, following the aftermath of empire rather than its peak. Because in the ancient world, the fall of a capital was never just the collapse of a city. It was the scattering of systems, memories, and material wealth across regions that suddenly had to redefine themselves. And Assyria's disappearance was not quiet. It was seismic. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the ancient sources describe devastation on a scale that reshaped the entire political landscape of Mesopotamia. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, once dominant across vast territories, disintegrated within a remarkably short span of time. Cities that had once paid tribute to its kings suddenly became independent, then absorbed into new emerging powers. The administrative network that had once directed wealth toward the center collapsed almost overnight. But what happens to imperial wealth when the center disappears? In Assyria's case, the answer seems to fracture into multiple possibilities at once. Some of Sennacherib's treasures may have been destroyed during the final siege. Nineveh's palaces, built largely of sun-dried brick and timber roofing, would have been highly vulnerable to fire. Once ignited, such structures collapse inward, burying whatever lies within under layers of burning debris and rubble. In this scenario, gold, carved ivory, ceremonial objects, and stored tribute could have been melted, crushed, or permanently lost beneath destruction layers that later archaeology can only partially interpret. But destruction rarely accounts for everything. The scale of Assyrian wealth was not confined to a single building or vault. It was distributed across palaces, temples, administrative centers, and storage facilities. Some of it would have been mobile by nature, tribute collected in transport, goods moving between regions, or resources held in provincial capitals. When central authority collapsed, these distributed assets would not have simply vanished. They would have moved, intentionally or otherwise. And that movement leaves behind very few clear traces. One possibility is that regional governors and military officials, acting in the final stages of the empire's disintegration, redirected wealth to local strongholds. In moments of uncertainty, loyalty often shifts from empire to survival. If this occurred, then portions of Sennacherib's accumulated riches may have been absorbed into emerging power centers in Babylonia, Media, or smaller regional polities that filled the vacuum left by Assyria's fall. But even if that redistribution happened, it would not necessarily appear as a single, identifiable transfer in the historical record. Instead, it would dissolve into countless smaller movements, traded, hidden, repurposed, or integrated into new administrative systems that no longer identified themselves as Assyrian. Another layer of uncertainty comes from the nature of Assyrian record-keeping itself. The empire documented tribute and conquest with extraordinary detail, but it is far less clear how, or whether, it recorded loss. Imperial inscriptions are designed to project stability and control. They celebrate acquisition, not disappearance. So even if large portions of wealth were moved or lost during collapse, the administrative voice that might have recorded it was itself part of the system that collapsed. Silence, in this case, is not absence of events, but absence of documentation. Archaeological evidence supports a picture of intense destruction at Nineveh, but also one of uneven preservation. Some areas show complete devastation, while others suggest more limited damage or later reuse. This uneven pattern complicates any attempt to reconstruct a single narrative of what happened to the empire's material wealth. Instead, it suggests multiple overlapping processes unfolding at once: warfare, looting, abandonment, and gradual repurposing. And then there is the question of what happened after the fall. The Babylonian and Median forces who contributed to Assyria's defeat became the inheritors of its territory and infrastructure. In ancient warfare, victory often included the redistribution of captured goods. It is entirely plausible that some portion of Assyrian wealth was absorbed into these emerging states, melted down, recast, or integrated into new royal treasuries. If so, the treasures of Sennacherib would not have disappeared. They would have been transformed into the foundations of successor empires. But transformation leaves no singular footprint. Over time, materials change form. Gold becomes ornamentation in new courts. Ivory becomes carved decoration in different architectural contexts. Weapons are refitted, inscriptions overwritten, objects repurposed until their original origin is no longer recognizable. What once belonged to Assyria becomes part of something else entirely, losing its identity while retaining its substance. And yet, despite this plausible cycle of redistribution and reuse, something still feels unresolved. Because Assyria was not a minor kingdom with modest holdings. It was a system of accumulation on an imperial scale. Centuries of expansion had concentrated resources across vast distances into a network designed to feed the center. To imagine that all of this could be fully absorbed, destroyed, or dispersed without leaving a clearer archaeological signature creates a tension between expectation and evidence. This is where another possibility quietly enters the discussion, not as certainty, but as speculation grounded in human behavior across collapsing systems. In moments of imperial breakdown, elites sometimes attempt to conceal wealth rather than surrender it. Hidden caches, buried deposits, sealed chambers, and relocated treasures appear repeatedly across different historical contexts. If similar actions occurred during the final days of Nineveh, then portions of Sennacherib's wealth may have been intentionally removed from circulation and hidden in locations that remain undiscovered. The geography of Mesopotamia offers no shortage of possibilities for such concealment. Remote desert margins, abandoned administrative sites, collapsed storage complexes, or locations later buried beneath centuries of sediment and reconstruction. But despite extensive archaeological work in the region, no confirmed cache directly linked to Sennacherib's central treasury has ever been identified. So the mystery persists in a peculiar state, not invisible, but unaccounted for. And perhaps that is what makes it endure. Because unlike legendary treasures that exist purely in myth, Sennacherib's wealth was real, documented indirectly through the scale of Assyrian power itself. The palaces, the campaigns, the tribute systems, all point toward vast accumulation. Yet the physical remnants of that accumulation remain fragmentary at best. What we are left with is not a complete disappearance, but a discontinuity between scale and survival. Standing among the ruins of Nineveh today, the outlines of imperial architecture still trace the ambition of a civilization that once believed in permanence. But beneath those outlines lies an unresolved question, one that archaeology can narrow but not fully close. Were Sennacherib's treasures destroyed in fire, dispersed across successor kingdoms, absorbed into new empires, or hidden away in places still untouched by excavation? Or does their absence reveal something more fundamental about how empires end? Not with the loss of wealth itself, but with the loss of the ability to trace where that wealth ultimately goes. As the uncertainty surrounding Lycurgus of Sparta lingers in the background of Greek antiquity, the narrative moves away from the shattered archives of Mesopotamia and into a landscape defined not by what was built, but by what was deliberately left unwritten. In the southern Peloponnese, the city of Sparta rises in the historical imagination as something almost paradoxical, a powerful civilization with an intentionally limited record of itself. Stone foundations lie scattered across the valley of the Urartu River, framed by mountains that seem to enclose the region in quiet isolation. Unlike other Greek city-states that expressed their identity through monumental temples, inscriptions, and literary production, Sparta is remembered for restraint. Its culture emphasized discipline over display, collective identity over individual legacy, and action over documentation. And within this carefully controlled silence, the figure of Lycurgus emerges as the origin point of its entire system. But the closer we look, the less certain that origin becomes. Lycurgus is traditionally described as the lawgiver who shaped Spartan society into its distinctive form. Ancient accounts attribute to him the establishment of social structures that defined Spartan life for centuries: communal meals, strict military education, the redistribution of land among citizens, and a system designed to suppress luxury in favor of collective discipline. These reforms, according to tradition, transformed Sparta into a society unlike any other in the ancient Greek world. And yet, no contemporary Spartan document confirms his existence. What survives instead are later narratives, written centuries after the supposed time of Lycurgus, attempting to reconstruct his life and actions. Herodotus refers to him as a foundational figure responsible for shaping Spartan institutions, but even he acknowledges uncertainty about his exact chronology. Later writers, particularly Plutarch, expand his story into a detailed biography filled with travels, consultations with the oracle at Delphi, and dramatic acts of self-imposed exile designed to preserve the permanence of his laws. But these accounts were written long after Sparta's formative centuries had passed. This raises a fundamental question. Is Lycurgus a historical individual, or a symbolic reconstruction of a long and gradual social transformation? One interpretation suggests that Lycurgus represents a consolidation of multiple reforms that took place over generations. Instead of a single lawgiver, Sparta may have undergone a slow evolution in response to internal pressures and external threats. The militarization of society, the emphasis on collective discipline, and the strict social hierarchy could have emerged incrementally, eventually being attributed to a single founding figure as a way of explaining systemic coherence. In this reading, Lycurgus becomes less a person and more a narrative anchor, a way of giving structure to complex historical change. Yet the tradition surrounding him is unusually specific in certain details. Accounts describe his consultation with Delphi before instituting reforms, suggesting a link between Spartan law and divine sanction. The oracle is said to have approved his constitution, lending religious legitimacy to the system he introduced. This connection between Sparta and Delphi is not unique in Greek history, but the consistency of its appearance in Lycurgus narratives adds an additional layer of intrigue. Why would later writers consistently tie the origins of Spartan law to a moment of divine consultation if it were purely symbolic? Some scholars suggest that even if Lycurgus was not a single historical figure, there may have been an early reform movement or influential leader whose actions became foundational to Spartan identity. Over time, that figure's role could have been expanded, idealized, and systematized into the semi-mythical lawgiver preserved in tradition. In this sense, Lycurgus may represent a real but obscured historical core, surrounded by layers of later interpretation. But even this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery, because Sparta itself is unusual among ancient Greek city-states in the degree to which it minimized written documentation of its own systems. While not entirely illiterate, Spartan society placed far less emphasis on literary preservation than its contemporaries. Much of what is known about its institutions comes from external observers, Athenian writers, later historians, and philosophical commentators who interpreted Sparta through their own cultural frameworks. This creates a structural gap in the historical record. We see Sparta through the reflections of others, not through its own preserved voice. And Lycurgus exists precisely at the center of that gap. Ancient traditions describe his reforms as deliberately designed to be permanent, yet unwritten. Laws were meant to be embedded in practice, reinforced through ritual, training, and communal life rather than extensive legal texts. If this is accurate, then the absence of direct documentation is not accidental. It is part of the system itself. But this raises another question. How does a society preserve foundational laws without writing them down in detail? Or more precisely, how does it ensure consistency across generations without a fixed textual reference? Sparta appears to have relied heavily on institutional memory, oral tradition, structured education, and strict social reinforcement. From childhood, citizens were immersed in a system that shaped behavior through repetition and communal expectation. In such a structure, the need for written codification becomes less central, but also more vulnerable to reinterpretation over time. And when later historians attempt to reconstruct its origins, they are forced to translate lived practice into narrative form. This is where Lycurgus becomes essential. He provides a point of origin, a figure through whom complexity becomes comprehensible. Without him, the emergence of Spartan society appears gradual, distributed, and difficult to define. With him, it becomes a story of intentional design. But history does not always align neatly with narrative structure. Some versions of the Lycurgus tradition include elements that complicate rather than clarify his identity. In certain accounts, he is said to have deliberately left Sparta after establishing its laws, traveling abroad and ultimately dying in exile. In others, his death is marked by ritual ambiguity, with some traditions suggesting his remains were not returned to Sparta so that his authority would remain tied to his laws rather than a physical body. This separation between individual and institution is unusual, and it reinforces the sense that Lycurgus occupies a symbolic role as much as a historical one. Even his name becomes part of the uncertainty. In ancient Greek, names often carried meaning or symbolic association, and some interpretations suggest that Lycurgus may itself have been a title or constructed designation rather than a personal name. If that is the case, then the question shifts once again. Are we searching for a missing individual, or for the origin point of a system that gradually became personified? Archaeology offers limited assistance here. Sparta's material remains are fragmented compared to other major Greek centers. While there are temples, civic structures, and burial sites, there is no single archaeological layer that can be clearly associated with a Lycurgan reform period. Instead, changes in material culture appear gradual, consistent with long-term evolution rather than sudden institutional redesign. And yet, the tradition persists. Sparta is still remembered as a society shaped by deliberate design rather than organic development. And Lycurgus remains the figure through whom that design is understood. So the mystery endures not in the physical record alone, but in the tension between memory and explanation. If Lycurgus was real, why is his historical footprint so faint? If he was not, why does his narrative remain so structurally central to understanding Sparta? And perhaps most importantly, when a society defines its identity through a figure who exists at the edge of history and myth, where does the truth of that identity actually reside? In the person who may have shaped it, or in the story that continues to define it? As the question of Lycurgus lingers in the quiet valleys of Sparta, the narrative shifts once again, away from the uncertainty of a single lawgiver and toward something broader, something more unsettling in its implications. The possibility that entire systems of history can be remembered clearly even when their origins cannot. Sparta, unlike many ancient cities, does not offer the comfort of abundant self-documentation. Its legacy survives through the observations of outsiders, filtered through distance, ideology, and time. And that alone already introduces a subtle distortion. When a civilization is described mostly by others, what survives is not its internal voice, but its interpretation. And Lycurgus sits precisely inside that interpretive gap. Ancient writers consistently present him as the architect of Spartan order, yet the absence of contemporary records forces every detail of his life into reconstruction. Even the most basic elements, when he lived, what he changed, how long his reforms took, remain unstable. And in the absence of certainty, tradition fills the space with narrative coherence. But coherence is not always evidence. Some modern interpretations suggest that what is attributed to Lycurgus may actually represent centuries of gradual social engineering. In this view, Sparta's transformation into a militarized society was not the result of a single moment of legislative genius, but a slow adaptation to constant regional pressure, internal instability, and the need for cohesion in a competitive Greek world. Over time, these incremental changes could have been retrospectively unified under one symbolic origin figure. This is not unusual in ancient history. Many societies compress complex developments into singular founders or pivotal moments. It provides clarity. It creates identity. It allows continuity to be explained through personality rather than process. But Sparta is unusual in how completely that compression seems to dominate its narrative. Because unlike Athens or other Greek city-states, where evolving institutions leave extensive written traces, Sparta's internal evolution remains largely opaque. What we see instead is the finished structure, fully formed in later descriptions, projected backward onto an origin that cannot be independently verified. And so Lycurgus becomes less a historical anchor and more a narrative necessity. Yet, even within that uncertainty, certain recurring themes remain difficult to dismiss. The idea of consultation with the oracle at Delphi, for example, appears consistently across traditions. Whether literal or symbolic, this connection suggests that Spartan identity was framed not only in political terms, but also in relation to divine authority. In ancient Greek culture, legitimacy was often strengthened through sacred endorsement, and linking foundational laws to Delphi would have reinforced their perceived permanence. But whether such a consultation occurred in a single historical moment, or was later constructed to explain existing practices, remains unknown. Another recurring element is the notion that Spartan laws were deliberately unwritten or minimally recorded. This concept, if accurate, would have profound consequences for historical reconstruction. A society that embeds its rules primarily through training, ritual, and oral transmission leaves very little textual residue. Over generations, such a system becomes highly stable internally, but externally opaque. And opacity is fertile ground for myth-making. If later observers encounter a society whose origins are not clearly documented, the temptation to assign authorship increases. Complexity demands explanation, and explanation often takes the form of individuals rather than processes. In this way, Lycurgus may function less as a historical record and more as a cognitive resolution, a way for ancient and later historians alike to make sense of a system whose development otherwise resists simplification. But even if that is true, it does not fully dissolve the mystery, because there are still moments in the tradition that resist easy symbolic interpretation. The accounts of deliberate exile, for instance, where Lycurgus is said to have left Sparta after instituting his laws, swearing citizens to uphold them in his absence. In some versions, he dies far from Sparta, ensuring that no physical tomb becomes a focal point of political dispute or reinterpretation. This separation between person and law is striking. It suggests an intentional removal of individual authority in favor of institutional permanence. Whether this reflects historical reality or later ideological construction is unclear, but the idea itself is consistent with Sparta's broader emphasis on collective identity over individual legacy. And yet, the more carefully we examine these traditions, the more they seem to hover between history and design. Archaeological evidence does not offer a definitive Lycurgan layer, a moment where material culture shifts abruptly in a way that clearly corresponds to a single reformer. Instead, what appears is gradual change. Settlement patterns evolve. Burial practices shift. Material artifacts reflect long-term adaptation rather than sudden restructuring. This aligns more closely with organic transformation than with centralized authorship. But absence of clear evidence is not evidence of absence of influence. It is entirely possible that an early reformer, or a small group of influential figures, initiated changes that were later amplified, standardized, and attributed to a single name for coherence. Over generations, that name could become the symbolic center of a much longer historical process. And once embedded in tradition, such a figure becomes difficult to separate from the system he represents. Lycurgus, then, exists in a space where history and identity overlap. He is simultaneously a potential individual, a symbolic construct, and a narrative tool used to explain one of the most distinctive societies of the ancient world. This ambiguity raises a deeper question about how ancient history is constructed. When sources are limited, fragmented, or external, historians are often forced to choose between competing models: individual agency or gradual evolution, intentional design or emergent structure. But Sparta resists that binary. It presents a system so cohesive in later description, yet so opaque in origin, that neither explanation feels fully sufficient on its own. And so the mystery persists, not because there is no answer, but because the available evidence allows multiple interpretations to coexist without resolution. Standing in the ruins of Sparta today, there is little to suggest the presence of a single founding moment. No inscription marks the arrival of Lycurgus. No archaeological layer definitively confirms his reforms. And yet, the idea of him remains deeply embedded in how the city is understood. So the question remains suspended, unresolved but persistent. If Sparta's identity was shaped by laws that left almost no written origin, and if those laws are attributed to a figure whose historical existence cannot be confirmed, then where does Lycurgus actually belong? In the realm of history, or in the structure of how history itself remembers order? As the uncertainty surrounding Lycurgus fades into the structured silence of ancient Sparta, the narrative shifts once more, crossing oceans this time, moving away from the ordered stone landscapes of Greece and into the dense, humid jungles and volcanic highlands of Mesoamerica. Here, in what is now southern Mexico, time does not present itself as a straight line of monuments and written records. Instead, it appears layered, fragmented, and partially concealed beneath centuries of vegetation and volcanic soil. Among the earliest known expressions of complex society in the region stands one of the most visually striking and intellectually unresolved achievements of the ancient world: the Olmec colossal heads. Carved from massive basalt boulders, some weighing tens of tons, these sculptures rise from the earth with an almost unsettling presence. They are human faces, large, deliberate, and intensely individualized. Heavy lips, broad noses, deep-set eyes, and helmet-like headgear define each one with distinct variation. They are not abstract symbols. They are not generic representations. Each head appears to carry its own identity, and yet their meaning remains unspoken. The Olmec civilization flourished between roughly 1500 BC and 400 BC along the Gulf Coast of present-day Mexico. Often considered one of the mother cultures of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs left behind monumental architecture, ceremonial centers, and a distinctive artistic tradition. But unlike later civilizations in the region, such as the Maya or Aztec, the Olmecs did not leave behind a fully deciphered written system that can clearly explain the purpose of these colossal sculptures. So what were they meant to represent? One widely accepted interpretation suggests that the heads depict rulers or elite figures. The individuality of each face supports this idea. Subtle differences in expression, facial structure, and headgear may reflect specific leaders, memorialized in stone as symbols of authority and power. In this reading, the colossal heads function as a form of political memory, monuments designed to project leadership across generations. But this explanation does not fully resolve the mystery of their scale or production. Each head was carved from basalt transported over long distances, sometimes from quarries located dozens of kilometers away. The effort required to move and shape these stones implies a highly organized society with significant engineering capabilities. Yet no surviving texts explain how these logistical feats were coordinated, or what rituals or systems justified the immense labor involved. This absence of explanation opens the door to further questions. Some researchers suggest that the heads may have held ceremonial or religious significance beyond simple portraiture. They could represent not just individual rulers, but also broader concepts of authority, ancestry, or divine legitimacy. The helmets or headgear carved into each sculpture might indicate participation in ritualized activities, possibly even ceremonial ball games or initiation rites whose details are now lost. Others propose that the heads were designed as territorial markers, placed strategically to define political or cultural boundaries. In this view, each sculpture becomes a statement of presence, an assertion of identity in a landscape where written records were limited or symbolic rather than descriptive. Yet even these interpretations leave something unresolved. Because the emotional neutrality of the faces resists easy categorization, they are neither clearly triumphant nor explicitly divine. They do not narrate events. They simply exist, watchful, grounded, and silent. And silence, in archaeology, often becomes its own kind of language. Some more speculative interpretations have suggested that the heads may encode cultural memory systems that are not yet understood, or that they represent mythological beings whose stories were transmitted orally and lost over time. These ideas remain outside mainstream consensus, but they reflect a deeper truth about the Olmec world. Much of its intellectual and symbolic framework has not survived in a form that can be fully translated. What remains is stone, immovable, expressive, and incomplete in its explanation. Even the positioning of the heads raises questions. Many are found in distinct archaeological sites such as San Lorenzo and La Venta, arranged in ways that suggest deliberate placement rather than random distribution. Were they originally part of larger ceremonial landscapes? Were they moved and repositioned over time? Or do they mark stages of cultural development that are no longer clearly traceable? Archaeology can map their locations, measure their dimensions, and reconstruct their methods of carving and transport. But it cannot fully recover the conceptual world that gave them meaning. And so the mystery persists, not because the heads are unreadable, but because their reading is incomplete. Standing before them today, one is confronted not with explanation, but with presence. Massive stone faces emerging from a civilization that left behind powerfully visual artifacts, but only fragmentary narrative context. They seem to observe without revealing, to represent without fully disclosing what they represent. So the question remains suspended in the humid air of ancient Mesoamerica. Are the Olmec colossal heads portraits of rulers, symbols of authority, or expressions of a belief system whose meaning has not yet been fully recovered? Or do they preserve something even more elusive, a form of understanding that cannot be easily translated into modern language at all? As the Olmec colossal heads stand in quiet defiance of interpretation, half buried in jungle memory and volcanic stone, the narrative moves forward once again, sliding deeper into the ancient world's unresolved patterns. Across continents and centuries, a familiar tension keeps reappearing. Civilizations leave behind form, but not always explanation. And the Olmec world is no exception. Beyond the carved faces, the landscape itself becomes part of the mystery. Rivers cut through dense lowlands, seasonal rains reshape the terrain, and vegetation constantly reclaims what human hands once cleared. In such an environment, permanence is never guaranteed. Even monumental stone, despite its weight and durability, exists in a world where visibility itself is temporary. The colossal heads were not isolated creations. They were part of a broader cultural system that included ceremonial centers, plazas, platforms, and sculptural traditions that extended beyond simple portraiture. Archaeological evidence suggests a society capable of coordinated labor, symbolic expression, and long-distance material transport, particularly in the movement of basalt from distant quarry sites. But capability does not automatically reveal meaning. One of the most persistent questions surrounding these sculptures is why such immense effort was devoted specifically to human faces at such scale. In many ancient societies, monumental art tends to emphasize gods, cosmological symbols, or mythological scenes. The Olmec heads, however, remain grounded in individuality. Each face is distinct. Each expression carries subtle variation. Even the headgear differs, suggesting differentiation rather than uniform representation. So, what exactly is being preserved in stone? The most widely supported interpretation remains that these are portraits of rulers or elite figures. In this view, the heads function as markers of authority, physical embodiments of leadership meant to project continuity across generations. The sheer scale of the sculptures would reinforce that authority, transforming individual identity into permanent landscape presence. But even within this explanation, uncertainty remains. Because no accompanying inscriptions survive to confirm names, events, or specific identities. There are no textual anchors that allow the heads to be tied to documented historical narratives. Instead, meaning must be inferred entirely from form, context, and comparative analysis. And inference, while powerful, always leaves space for alternative readings. Some scholars suggest that the heads may have been part of a more complex ritual geography, arranged within ceremonial spaces that are now partially lost beneath sediment and vegetation. In this interpretation, their placement could reflect social hierarchy, ancestral veneration, or cosmological alignment. The heads may have been more than representations. They may have been participants in a spatial system of ritual meaning. Yet even this model raises further questions. If the heads were part of a structured ritual landscape, why does so little of that system remain clearly legible today? Is the fragmentation we see the result of environmental change, later cultural transformation, or simply the limits of archaeological recovery in a dense tropical setting? Other interpretations move further into uncertainty. Some propose that the heads could encode collective memory systems that were primarily oral, where sculpture acted as mnemonic anchors rather than narrative records. In such a system, each face might correspond not to a single individual, but to a lineage, a role, or a symbolic category whose meaning has not survived in written form. These ideas remain speculative, but they highlight an important point. The Olmec world may not have separated symbolism and identity in the same way modern interpretation tends to assume. And then there is the question of disappearance, not of the heads themselves, but of the civilization that created them. The Olmec cultural horizon gradually transitions into later Mesoamerican traditions, but without a clear moment of collapse. Instead, there is continuity mixed with transformation. Styles evolve. Centers shift. Cultural elements are absorbed into emerging societies. The result is a historical landscape where origins are visible, but not sharply bounded. This makes the colossal heads even more enigmatic. They appear as fixed points within a system that otherwise flows and transforms. Why invest so heavily in permanence within a world defined by change? Archaeology continues to recover new fragments, sites, tools, ceremonial objects, but the meaning of the colossal heads remains fundamentally open. Their presence is undeniable, but their purpose is still interpreted rather than confirmed. And so they remain in place, weathered but unyielding, their faces directed outward as if observing not only their own time, but every generation that would later attempt to understand them. In the end, the mystery is not only what the Olmec colossal heads represent, but why their meaning resists closure so completely. Are they portraits of rulers whose names were never recorded in writing, symbols of authority whose language has been lost, or something more abstract still? Monuments designed to communicate in ways that no longer align with how meaning is read today. And if their purpose was once clear to those who carved them, then what does it say about the distance between past understanding and present interpretation, that we can still see their faces so clearly yet cannot fully hear what they were meant to say? As the carved faces of the Olmec colossal heads fade back into the dense, humid silence of Mesoamerica, the narrative shifts once more, this time toward a very different landscape. The jungle gives way to stone hills, arid air, and a city built into steep terrain where water, rather than sculpture, becomes the central concern of survival. Here, in ancient Jerusalem, beneath layers of later construction and living city above it, lies one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the Iron Age, the Siloam Tunnel. At first glance, it appears unassuming today, a narrow carved passageway stretching through solid limestone, connecting the Gihon spring outside the old city walls to the pool of Siloam within. But in the 8th century BC, this tunnel represented something far more critical than infrastructure. It was a solution to a problem that carried both practical and existential weight, securing a reliable water source in a city under threat. According to historical understanding, the tunnel was constructed during the reign of King Hezekiah, as described in biblical tradition and supported by archaeological evidence. The so-called Siloam inscription, discovered within the tunnel itself, records part of its construction process in ancient script, describing the moment when two teams of workers, digging from opposite ends, finally met in the middle. And yet, the deeper one examines this achievement, the more questions begin to emerge. The tunnel is roughly 533 meters long, carved through solid rock with a winding, indirect path that does not follow a straight geometric line. Instead, it curves and shifts, suggesting that the two teams did not have direct visual contact, relying instead on sound, intuition, and perhaps subtle geological cues to guide their progress toward one another. How did they manage such precision without modern surveying tools? The meeting point inside the tunnel is one of its most intriguing features. The inscription describes the final moment when the two groups heard each other's voices through the rock and adjusted their direction until they connected. Archaeological analysis confirms that the tunnel was indeed completed from two directions, meeting with remarkable accuracy, though not perfectly aligned. But the method remains partially unclear. Some researchers suggest that natural fissures in the limestone may have transmitted sound or guided the workers indirectly. Others propose that water flow, humidity gradients, or even surface markers above ground could have been used to coordinate direction. Yet none of these explanations fully eliminate the sense of extraordinary precision achieved under extremely limited conditions. And so the question persists. How was such a complex subterranean project coordinated in real time without direct communication systems? The engineering challenge becomes even more striking when considering the tools available in the 8th century BC. Iron chisels, hammerstones, and basic oil lamps would have been the primary instruments. Working in confined, oxygen-limited spaces, with uneven rock layers and no prior mapping of the subsurface geology, the task required not only technical skill, but sustained coordination over an extended period. And yet, the tunnel was completed successfully. The Siloam inscription itself adds another layer to the mystery. Written in early Hebrew script, it provides a rare first-person account of the construction process. It describes the tension as the two teams approached each other, the final breakthrough moment, and the flow of water that connected the city to its vital source. It is one of the earliest known engineering narratives from the ancient Near East. But even this inscription leaves gaps. It tells us what happened, but not fully how it was achieved. Archaeological study of the tunnel's path reveals subtle deviations in direction, suggesting that the workers adjusted their course multiple times during excavation. Some of these changes appear to respond to natural features in the rock, while others seem less easily explained. The absence of a straight-line trajectory has led some researchers to propose that acoustic or hydrological cues may have played a larger role than previously assumed. Still, certainty remains elusive. Was the tunnel the result of carefully planned surveying knowledge that has not survived in written form? Or did the builders rely on a combination of trial, error, and environmental intuition that modern analysis can only partially reconstruct? Even the motivation behind its specific curved shape invites interpretation. A more direct route would have been shorter, yet the tunnel follows a sinuous path through the rock. Whether this reflects geological constraints, human error, or adaptive decision-making during construction remains an open question. What is clear is that the Siloam tunnel represents not only an engineering solution, but a moment where human necessity intersected with limited technological means in a way that still challenges modern understanding. Standing within the tunnel today, one can still see the marks of ancient tools etched into the stone walls. The passage is narrow, uneven, and dark, yet continuous. Water still flows through parts of it, connecting past and present in a way that feels almost uninterrupted. And so the mystery remains, not in whether the tunnel exists or functioned, but in how its creators achieved such a feat with the knowledge and resources available to them. Was it the result of lost surveying techniques, collective intuition refined through generations, or simply a level of practical ingenuity that has been underestimated by modern assumptions? And if such precision could be achieved beneath a city under pressure nearly 3 millennia ago, what other knowledge might still lie hidden within the engineering shadows of the ancient world? As the final echoes of the Siloam tunnel's construction fade into the rock-cut silence of ancient Jerusalem, the narrative does not settle. It continues forward, following the water that still moves through ancient stone, as if memory itself has found a path it refuses to abandon. Because tunnels like this do more than connect two points. They connect necessity to ingenuity in a way that leaves behind very few written explanations. And that absence becomes the next layer of the mystery. The Siloam Tunnel is often studied as a triumph of ancient engineering, but it is also a rare glimpse into how ancient cities solved problems that were both urgent and existential. Water was not a convenience in the 8th century BC. It was survival. A city without secure access to water could not withstand siege, drought, or isolation. And Jerusalem, positioned between competing regional powers, would have understood that vulnerability intimately. So the tunnel was not just built, it was driven through stone under pressure, political, environmental, and human. And yet, despite its importance, no detailed ancient manual survives explaining the methods behind its construction. Only the result remains. The inscription found within the tunnel provides a momentary window into the final phase of the project. It describes the sound of workers calling through the rock, the final alignment of two teams digging from opposite ends, and the moment the connection was achieved. It is one of the earliest known records of collaborative subterranean engineering in the ancient world. But it is also, in its own way, incomplete. It captures the moment of success, not the long process that led to it. How were the two teams coordinated across hundreds of meters of solid limestone without modern measurement tools? Some researchers suggest that surface-level markers may have guided direction, with shafts or reference points placed above ground to align underground excavation. Others propose that the workers may have followed the natural slope of the rock, using water flow or subtle acoustic feedback to adjust their direction over time. There is also the possibility of geological intuition, knowledge accumulated through generations of quarrying and construction in similar terrain, passed down orally rather than recorded in writing. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the precision of the meeting point. The two excavation paths do not align perfectly in a straight geometric sense, yet they converge successfully enough to allow water to flow continuously through the tunnel. This suggests not only coordination, but adaptive correction during the digging process. In other words, the workers may have continuously adjusted their direction based on evolving sensory cues that modern analysis can only partially reconstruct. And that raises another question. Was this level of subterranean coordination unique to this project, or part of a broader but now lost tradition of ancient engineering practice? Across the ancient Near East, there are hints of advanced hydraulic systems, channels, aqueducts, reservoirs, designed to manage scarce water resources in complex environments. Many of these systems demonstrate a high degree of environmental awareness and technical skill, yet the specific methods used to design and align them are often absent from the written record. The Siloam Tunnel stands out not because it is the only example, but because it preserves the human process inside the structure itself. Every chisel mark, every deviation in the tunnel's path, becomes a kind of frozen decision, a record not written in text, but in stone. And still, the deeper mystery is not only how it was built, but how it was conceived. What kind of planning system allows two independent teams to converge underground with such accuracy? Was there a central surveying framework that has not survived in written form? Or was the process more organic, adjusting continuously, responding to sound, resistance, and intuition in real time? Even the slight curvature of the tunnel suggests a dynamic process rather than a rigid blueprint. It bends, adjusts, and responds to the geology it passes through, as if the construction itself was negotiating with the rock. And perhaps that is where the real insight lies. Not in precision as we define it today, but in adaptability. The tunnel represents a kind of ancient problem-solving that does not always leave behind clear theoretical documentation. Instead, it leaves outcomes, successful ones, that modern analysis must work backward from, reconstructing intent from result. Standing inside the tunnel today, with water still moving quietly through its carved passage, it is difficult not to feel the weight of that absence. The space is narrow, uneven, and dimly lit, yet it carries an extraordinary continuity of function across millennia. What was once a desperate engineering solution is still, in a way, alive. And so the question remains suspended in the darkness between stone walls and flowing water. Was the Siloam tunnel the product of a known but lost engineering tradition, or an extraordinary one-time achievement of human coordination that modern understanding can describe but never fully recreate?